Ellen, a young girl barely standing 4.6 feet tall, with a slim figure and a youthful face that made her look no older than 10, was in a dire state. She wore a simple white dress, and her large round eyes were filled with pain and fear. Her swollen abdomen was shockingly out of place on her small frame. Next to her, Edward, a man whose face was etched with worry and distress, rushed into the hospital with the girl in his arms, shouting desperately, "Doctor, please! She's about to give birth!" Edward's cries echoed through the hospital corridors, grabbing the attention of everyone around. The nurses, taken aback, hurried towards them, while patients and their companions watched the scene in disbelief and concern. "What's going on?" asked one of the nurses, trying to stay calm as she approached the pair. Seeing Ellen's condition, she fought to maintain her professional composure despite the outrage brewing inside her. "She's in labor!" Edward exclaimed, his voice breaking with desperation. "Please, we need help." Wasting no time, the nurse called through the intercom, "We need a stretcher at the main entrance, quickly." As they waited for the stretcher, the nurse tried to comfort Ellen, who was barely conscious from the pain. "Hang in there, sweetheart. We're going to help you," she said gently, though inside her anger and confusion were growing. How could such a young girl be in this situation? When the stretcher arrived, they carefully placed Ellen on it and rushed her to the emergency room. Edward attempted to follow, but another nurse stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir, but you need to stay here," she said firmly, yet with compassion. "We'll take care of her. We need to know what happened." Edward nodded, his face a mix of anguish and despair. She's my responsibility," he murmured, his words almost choked by the weight of the situation. "I can't leave her alone." In the emergency room, doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize Ellen. The on-call doctor, a man with years of experience, had never seen anything like this. As he scrubbed his hands, he thought back to when his shift started, thinking it would be a routine day. What kind of monster would do this? He muttered to himself, the anger clear in his eyes. "She's just a child." Meanwhile, in the waiting room, whispers grew into audible conversations as those present tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. "Did you see that girl? She can't be more than 10, remarked a pregnant woman, her face pale with disbelief. "And the man who was with her," added another, with a tone of disapproval. Edward sat in the corner, his head buried in his hands, trying to shut out the sharp comments surrounding him. The room buzzed with tension as voices whispered harsh judgments. He must be the one responsible. How could anyone do something so awful? "He must be a creep," another person muttered in disgust. "He should be locked up for what he did." Edward knew he couldn't let their words get to him. His main concern was Ellen's well-being. In the operating room, the doctor approached Ellen, offering some comfort before the anesthesia took hold. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you're okay," he said, his voice filled with fierce determination. As the procedure began, the medical team prepared for any surprises. Nurses moved in and out, bringing supplies and avoiding eye contact with the man anxiously waiting outside. Their thoughts were with the young girl on the operating table, and one question echoed in their minds. How had she ended up in this situation? Time seemed to stand still as the hospital was engulfed in an atmosphere of tension and expectation. Outside the emergency room, the tension was palpable, and the murmurs grew louder. Edward Jones sat in a hallway chair, his face buried in his hands, silently sobbing as worry consumed him. Ellen had been rushed in to give birth, and the uncertainty about her condition was torture. Around him, the whispers started low but quickly escalated into audible, judgmental conversations. "Did you see that girl? She can't be more than 10 years old," one woman murmured to her companion, disbelief in her eyes. "And the man who was with her," another replied with disdain. What kind of monster would do something like that? He must be a pervert, added someone else, whispering in disgust. He should be locked up for what he's done to that poor girl. Edward looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He tried to block out the comments, but every word pierced his heart like a dagger. Edward knew he couldn't change how others saw him at that moment, but the uncertainty about Ellen's condition was eating him up inside. "We need to call the police," someone shouted from the back of the room. "We can't just stand by and let this happen." A nurse who had been watching with a mix of frustration and professionalism approached Edward. "Sir, we need you to tell us exactly what happened," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with compassion. Edward looked at her with desperation in his eyes. "Ellen, she needs help. That's all that matters right now," he replied, his voice breaking. The nurse nodded, understanding that she wouldn't get much more from him in that state. "We'll do everything we can for her," she assured, trying to calm him. Meanwhile, an older woman, with a frown and her arms crossed, couldn't hold back her anger any longer. "It's a disgrace. That man should be locked up," she shouted, directing her fury at Edward. "Yes, we can't let someone like that walk free," another person agreed, as more voices joined in the chorus of condemnation. "Everyone, please calm down," one of the head nurses intervened, trying to maintain order. "This is a hospital, and we need to focus on taking care of our patients." "But we can't ignore what's happening," a young woman replied, glaring at Edward with disdain. How could anyone do something so terrible? The waiting room filled with murmurs of agreement, as some people began pulling out their phones to call the police. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and Edward, feeling cornered, just closed his eyes, trying to shut everything out. Suddenly a tall, burly man stood up and strode toward Edward with determined steps. Without saying a word, he grabbed Edward by the collar and yanked him from his seat. "You're a disgrace!" the man yelled, his face flushed with rage. "How could you do this to a child?" Edward, shocked and terrified, raised his hands in surrender. "No, wait, you don't understand," he tried to explain, his voice trembling. "There's nothing to understand," the man shot back, tightening his grip. "You're a monster, and you have to pay for this." The situation was on the brink of spiraling out of control when a nurse rushed over and tried to pull the man away from Edward. "Stop! Let him go!" she shouted, placing herself between them. "We've already called the police. They'll handle this." The man shoved Edward back into the chair before letting go. The nurse quickly made sure Edward was okay before turning to the furious man. "I understand your anger, but we can't allow violence here. Let the authorities take care of this." Edward, struggling to catch his breath, remained seated, trying to calm himself down. Edward knew that he couldn't change how others saw the situation at that moment, but he needed to stay calm for Ellen's sake. Just a few minutes later, 2 police officers entered the room, responding to the numerous calls they'd received. They approached Edward with serious professional expressions. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of the officers said, placing a firm yet non-threatening hand on Edward's shoulder. "But Ellen, she's—" Edward tried to protest, but his voice broke once again. "We'll look into what's going on here," the other officer reassured him. "But we need you to come with us to clear up a few things." With his heart heavy and his mind clouded with worry, Edward stood up and followed the officers while the murmurs and judgmental stares continued around him. He knew he had to tell the truth, but at that moment, all he could think about was Ellen's safety, desperately hoping that the doctors could save her. The walk to the police car felt like a march of shame. Each step echoed in Edward's mind, reminding him of the seriousness of the situation. The whispers and looks of disdain from those nearby were like poisoned arrows piercing his soul. Once at the station, Edward was led to an interrogation room. The room was cold and sterile, with grey walls and a softly buzzing fluorescent light. The metal table and uncomfortable chairs only heightened his sense of isolation and despair. "Sit down," one of the detectives ordered, pointing to the chair across from him. Edward complied, feeling the handcuffs biting into his wrists. "I'm Detective Ramirez, and this is Detective Gonzalez," the man said, opening a thick file. "We've received reports suggesting that you've committed an extremely serious act. We want to hear your side of the story." Edward took a deep breath. "Ellen is not a child," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She's my wife. She's 25, but she has a rare medical condition that makes her look much younger." The detectives exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. "You expect us to believe that?" Gonzalez asked skeptically. "It sounds like a convenient excuse." "It's not an excuse," Edward insisted. "We can provide medical records to prove it. She's been diagnosed with a pituitary gland dysfunction that affects her growth." Ramirez leaned forward, his expression stern. "So why hasn't anyone heard of this condition before? And why hasn't anyone else verified your story?" "We're going to need more than just your word," Gonzalez said, crossing his arms. "The situation looks very different from where we're standing." The interrogation room door swung open abruptly, and a resolute-looking lawyer stepped in. "I'm Edward Jones's attorney," he declared. "I demand a private conversation with my client." The detectives reluctantly exited the room, leaving Edward alone with his lawyer. Mr. Martinez, his lawyer, sat down across from him, his expression a blend of concern and determination. "Edward, I've spoken with Ellen," Mr. Martinez began. "She's okay and doing everything she can to sort this out. But you need to stay calm and trust that we'll clear this up." "Thank you," Edward whispered, feeling a wave of relief. "This is a terrible misunderstanding." "I know," Mr. Martinez replied, "but we need to prove it with evidence. I'm working on getting Ellen's medical records and contacting her doctor." When the detectives returned, Mr. Martinez stood up. "Apologies, detectives, but my client is entitled to a fair defense. Here are the preliminary documents that prove Ellen's condition." Ramirez took the papers, scrutinizing them closely. "This is just the beginning," he said sternly. "We need to verify every detail. Until then, Mr. Jones will remain in custody." "This is unfair," Edward protested, feeling desperation creeping over him. "Ellen needs my support, and I'm a victim in this too." "I understand," Gonzalez replied, though his tone remained skeptical. "But until we can confirm everything, we need to proceed cautiously." The following hours were a mix of uncertainty and agonizing waiting. Edward was taken to a cell where time seemed to stand still. His thoughts swirled like a tornado, reminding him of every happy moment with Ellen and the harsh reality they now faced. The hospital was engulfed in a tense atmosphere as Ellen Walker, a young woman with a petite appearance but a notably swollen belly, was rushed to the delivery room. The situation was so unusual that everyone present couldn't help but whisper among themselves, filled with disbelief and concern. Dr. Mitchell, the lead physician on duty that night, hurried towards the delivery room, his mind racing. How is this possible? He kept asking himself. He had encountered unusual cases throughout his career, but this was something entirely new. "Prepare for an emergency C-section," Dr. Mitchell ordered as he entered the delivery room. The nurses and assistants moved efficiently, setting up the surgical equipment and ensuring Ellen was ready for the procedure. Ellen lay on the stretcher, her eyes closed, her face pale from pain and exhaustion. Despite her delicate appearance, her body showed all the signs of advanced labor. "Doctor, her vital signs are stable," one of the nurses reported, breaking the tense silence. Dr. Mitchell nodded, pulling on his surgical gloves. "All right, let's begin." As he made the first incision, Dr. Mitchell couldn't help but notice the details. Ellen's internal organs appeared fully developed and in perfect condition. Her uterus and ovaries were those of a grown woman, not a child. "This is incredible," he muttered to himself, though his remark didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the team. "What's going on, Doctor?" asked the head nurse, Mrs. Lopez, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Dr. Mitchell looked up, his eyes filled with wonder. "This young woman's organs are completely normal for someone in her 20s. There's nothing that suggests she should look the way she does." The team continued their work in silence, processing the information as they assisted with the delivery. After a few tense minutes, the loud, clear cry of a newborn filled the room. A wave of relief swept over everyone present. "It's a boy," Dr. Mitchell announced, lifting the newborn so Ellen could see him before the nurses took him to be cleaned and checked. Once the baby's well-being was ensured, Dr. Mitchell turned his attention back to Ellen. With great care, he completed the surgery, making sure there were no complications. As Ellen was moved to a recovery room, Dr. Mitchell removed his gloves and mask, still deep in thought. "We need to investigate this further," he said aloud, addressing the rest of the team. "Something here doesn't add up with what we know." Hours later, Ellen began to regain consciousness. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the bright light in the room. Beside her, a nurse held her baby, wrapped in a soft blanket. "Ellen, your son is healthy and strong," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "Would you like to hold him?" Ellen nodded weakly, tears welling up in her eyes as she took the little one into her arms. "Thank you. Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The nurse watched the tender scene before speaking again. "Ellen, we need to talk to you about your condition. There are some things Dr. Mitchell needs to understand." Ellen nodded, knowing this moment would come. "I know. I'm ready to explain." Dr. Mitchell entered the room, his face still reflecting the seriousness of the situation. He approached Ellen's bedside and took a seat in a nearby chair. "Ellen, your internal organs are fully developed, like those of an adult woman," he began, carefully choosing his words. "However, your external appearance is that of a child. Can you help us understand how this is possible?" Ellen nodded, adjusting the baby in her arms. "I have a rare condition called hypopituitarism," she said softly but firmly. "It affects my pituitary gland, preventing my body from growing and developing normally on the outside, though inside I'm an adult woman." Dr. Mitchell nodded slowly, taking in the information. "That explains a lot, but we need to document all of this properly. We'll have to contact your previous doctors and gather all the records we can." Ellen glanced at her baby, then looked up at the doctor. "I understand. I'll do everything I can to help." Just then, a nurse entered the room with a worried expression. "Dr. Mitchell, there's something you need to know. Edward, Ellen's husband, has been taken into custody by the police. They're accusing him of a serious crime." Ellen felt as if her world was collapsing around her. "No! This must be a mistake," she exclaimed, her voice filled with desperation. "Edward is my husband. He hasn't done anything wrong." Dr. Mitchell stood up, his expression hardening. "I'm going to talk to the authorities. We need to get this sorted out immediately." The following hours were a mix of anxiety and waiting. Ellen was interviewed by several nurses and doctors, trying to gather all the necessary information. At the same time, Dr. Mitchell reached out to the physicians who had treated Ellen in the past to obtain her medical records. Finally, Dr. Mitchell met with the police chief, Captain Rodriguez, in a private room at the hospital. "Captain, I need to talk to you about Edward Jones," he began, his tone formal and urgent. "I'm listening, Doctor," replied the captain, his face expressionless. "Edward is not a criminal. His wife, Ellen, has a rare medical condition that affects her physical growth," Dr. Mitchell explained, handing over a folder containing the medical records. "These documents prove it." The captain reviewed the documents carefully, his expression softening slightly as he read. "I understand, Doctor. This is highly unusual, but we'll do everything we can to clear up the situation." Meanwhile, in the recovery room, Ellen held her baby tightly, praying that everything would be resolved soon. Finally, the door opened, and Dr. Mitchell entered, with a look of relief. "Ellen, I have good news," he said gently. "Captain Rodriguez has reviewed the documents, and they're willing to release Edward while we continue the investigation. Everything's going to be fine." Ellen let out a sigh of relief, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for everything." At that moment, Edward was escorted back into the room by two officers. His face showed signs of strain, but it brightened when he saw Ellen and their child. "Ellen," he whispered, moving closer to the bed. "I'm here." Ellen looked up, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Edward, everything's going to be fine now. We'll get through this together." As the family reunited, Dr. Mitchell and his team continued working to document the case and ensure that Ellen and her baby received the best care possible. Ellen's case became one of the most unforgettable moments in Dr. Mitchell's career. Although she had given birth to a healthy baby, her petite frame and medical condition required her to stay in the hospital for further care. News of her situation quickly spread throughout the hospital, sparking both curiosity and deep sympathy among the staff and other patients. Each day, Edward was by Ellen's side, caring for her and the baby with a dedication that touched everyone who saw him. The nurses, who were used to witnessing all kinds of situations, couldn't help but feel a bit envious as they watched the attention and love Edward showered on his wife. "Ellen, here's your breakfast," said one of the nurses, Mrs. Ramirez, with a warm smile as she placed the tray on the bedside table. "Today we have oatmeal, orange juice, and some fresh fruit." "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez," Ellen replied, struggling to sit up. Her voice was soft but filled with gratitude. "Everyone here has been so kind to me." The nurse nodded, adjusting the pillows behind Ellen to make her more comfortable. "It's the least we can do. Your case is very special to all of us." At that moment, Edward entered the room, carrying their newborn son Jonathan in his arms. His face lit up when he saw Ellen, and he leaned in to give her a kiss on the forehead. "Good morning, my love," Edward said tenderly. "Jonathan and I have come to see you." Ellen smiled, her eyes shining with love and gratitude. "Good morning, Edward. How's our little one?" "He's perfect," Edward replied, cradling the baby gently. "He's strong and healthy, thanks to you." Mrs. Ramirez observed the scene with a smile. "Edward, you're a wonderful father. We don't see someone so dedicated and loving every day." "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez," Edward said, looking at Ellen with adoration. "I would do anything for my family." As the days passed, the bond between Edward and Ellen did not go unnoticed by the other patients and hospital staff. Their love and dedication became a frequent topic of conversation, generating admiration and respect. One afternoon, as Edward helped Ellen walk down the hallway to strengthen her legs, an older patient, Mrs. Garcia, approached them. "Excuse me," she said with a kind smile. I just wanted to tell you that you've inspired me so much. Seeing the love and care you have for each other is truly beautiful." "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia," Ellen replied, leaning on Edward's arm. "We've been through a lot together, and we're grateful to have each other." Mrs. Garcia nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's what matters. Love and family are the most important things in life." As the days went by, Ellen gradually recovered, but her condition still required continuous care. Every day, Edward made sure she was comfortable, bringing her fresh flowers, reading her favorite books, and ensuring she always had what she needed. One afternoon, as Edward helped Ellen settle in after a short walk, one of the younger nurses, Miss Perez, approached with a shy smile. "Excuse me," she said, a bit nervously. "I just wanted to mention that everyone here talks about how amazing you are, Edward. The way you take care of Ellen and your son is truly inspiring." Edward smiled, gently squeezing Ellen's hand. "Thank you, Miss Perez. I'm just doing what any husband would do for the woman he loves." Ellen looked at Edward with tears of happiness in her eyes. "You're the best, Edward. I don't know what I'd do without you." Miss Perez nodded, visibly moved. "You two are a really special couple. I hope you both recover soon and can enjoy your life together." Edward and Ellen's relationship touched not only the nurses, but also the medical staff. Dr. Mitchell, who had been closely monitoring Ellen's progress, often stopped by to chat with them. "Edward, Ellen," Dr. Mitchell said one afternoon while reviewing Ellen's chart, "I'm impressed with how you've handled this situation. Your love and dedication are truly remarkable." "Thank you, Doctor," Edward replied, with Ellen nodding in agreement. "We're grateful for everything you've done for us here." Dr. Mitchell smiled as he closed the chart. "It's a pleasure to help such a strong and united family. Ellen, your recovery is coming along well. With a bit more time and care, you'll soon be able to go home." The doctor's words brought a wave of relief and hope to Ellen and Edward. They knew the road to full recovery was still long, but they faced each day with determination and the unwavering support of those around them. As the sun set over the hospital, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink, Ellen lay back in her bed with Edward and Jonathan by her side. She felt a deep peace and immense gratitude for life and for the love she shared with her family. "Ellen," Edward whispered, gently stroking her hair, "I love you more than anything in this world. Nothing will change that." "And I love you too, Edward," Ellen responded, her eyes filled with emotion. "Together, we can overcome anything." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth and support of their loved ones and the hospital staff, Ellen and Edward knew that no matter what challenges they faced, they would always have each other. Their love, stronger than ever, was the true force that sustained them and guided them toward a bright and hopeful future. After spending several weeks in the hospital, the day finally arrived when Ellen, Edward, and their little Jonathan could head home. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, heralding a fresh start for the young family. Edward gently pushed Ellen's wheelchair while she cradled Jonathan in her arms. His cherubic face and bright eyes filled with curious wonder as he took in the world around him. "We're ready to go home, Ellen," Edward said with a warm smile, helping his wife slowly rise from the chair. "Everything is going to be all right." "Yes, Edward. I'm ready," Ellen replied, feeling a blend of excitement and relief. "I can't wait to begin this new chapter with our family." As they exited the hospital, they were met by a throng of journalists and photographers. The flashes of cameras were relentless, capturing every moment as the family made their way to the exit. "Ellen! Edward! How do you feel about going home?" one reporter shouted. "We feel incredibly blessed and grateful," Edward responded, gently squeezing Ellen's hand. "The love and support we've received have given us the strength to get through it all." "Ellen, tell us about your experience in the hospital," another journalist asked, thrusting a microphone toward her. Ellen smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "It's been a challenging journey, but we've had the support of a wonderful medical team and our family. I'm so thankful for all the love and care we've received." As they continued to walk, the reporters kept firing questions, but Edward and Ellen remained calm and appreciative, aware that their story had touched the hearts of many. Once home, the family began to adjust to their new life together. Time flew by, and Jonathan grew up healthy and strong, surrounded by his parents' unwavering love. Edward and Ellen's story became an inspiration for many, a reminder that true love can overcome any obstacle. 6 years later, on a peaceful summer afternoon, Edward and Ellen sat on their porch, watching Jonathan play in the yard. The setting sun cast a warm golden light all around, and the air was filled with the joyful sounds of their son's laughter. "Look at our little one, Ellen," Edward said with a smile, his eyes full of pride and love. "It's amazing how much he's grown." "Yes, he's such a wonderful boy," Ellen replied, taking Edward's hand. "I can't believe how much our lives have changed since he was born." Edward nodded, gently squeezing Ellen's hand. "We've been through so much, but every moment has been worth it. I'm so grateful to have you and Jonathan." "And I feel the same about you, Edward," Ellen said, her eyes glistening with tears of happiness. "Your love and support have been my strength. I don't know what I would do without you." "I'll always be here for you, Ellen," Edward said, leaning down to gently kiss her. "No matter what the future holds, I know we can get through it together." At that moment, Jonathan dashed toward them, his face bright with a mischievous grin. "Mom, Dad, look what I found," he shouted, holding a tiny bug in his hands. Ellen and Edward laughed, reveling in their son's pure joy. "That's awesome, Jonathan," Edward said, ruffling his son's hair. "You're an amazing little explorer." As the sun set, the family gathered on the porch, savoring the peace and happiness of being together. Edward and Ellen's story had not only been a testament to their love and resilience, but also a source of inspiration for everyone lucky enough to know them. So, surrounded by their son's love and unwavering support from each other, Edward and Ellen looked toward the future with hope and confidence, knowing that together they could face any challenge and cherish every moment of their shared life.